Welcome to the Neurosurgeon's Journey, part of the Library of Brain and Spine Group's Medical Student Neurosurgery Training Center and a collaboration with the AANS's Young Neurosurgeons Committee. I'm your co-host, Michael Kortz. I'm currently the Senior Student Director of Education Resources for MSNTC, and shortly we'll be joined by your other co-host, Dr. Jeremiah Johnson. He is an Assistant Professor of Neurosurgery at the Baylor College of Medicine and is the current chair of the YNC. We're happy to have you with us as we look deeper into the rewarding life of a neurosurgeon and explore what it takes to get there. Dr. Johnson, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you, Michael?
Doing great. I'm excited to talk about this. Certainly a topic that's high on my list in terms of what's important in my journey. Dr. Christopher Graffeo, he's the chief resident at Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, where he is also completing an in-folded fellowship in skull-based neuro-oncology. Next year, he'll be completing an open cerebrovascular and skull-based fellowship under Dr. Michael Lawton at the Barrow Neurological Institute. Dr. Graffeo, how are you doing today?
Hey, Michael, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. Doing well. Excited to chat with you and Jeremiah and Joey and the rest of the audience, I suppose, about sub-Is and sort of one of the, quintessential steps in the pathway into neurosurgery.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that introduction. That's great. Our second guest is Dr. Joseph Linzey. He's a PGY-2 at the University of Michigan, where he completed his medical school and also earned a master's degree in clinical research from their School of Public Health. He's interested in a career in cerebrovascular and endovascular surgery. Joey, it's great to have you on.
It's great to be here.
So it kind of already set up the conversation a little bit. The idea is getting a junior resident, senior resident perspective on the sub-internship and interview, understand a little bit more about what that process is. What is a sub-internship? Why you think this is an important topic to talk about?
Yeah. So my apologies to those who already know what this is, because I'm going to start as if, you're not even in medical school or medicine. So essentially,
it's great.
What happens is you work your way through medical school. You end up in rotations and clinical rotations where you are in services for certain periods of time. So general surgery, 4 weeks, neurology, 4 weeks, et cetera. Now, some of the surgical subspecialties, and this is very much a requisite in neurosurgery, is that in addition to your normal medical school rotations, you have to spend time on a neurosurgery service. And that's particularly important because not every medical school lets you even spend time on a neurosurgery service. So if you intend to go into neurosurgery, somehow you've been exposed to it and you want to go into that field, before you go into any kind of match, it is extremely, really prerequisite in neurosurgery that you do sub-internships, almost always one at a home program if you happen to have a residency in your medical school. If not, then these are all away experiences, but then it usually 2 additional, sometimes more, month-long rotations at other neurosurgery programs around the country. How you strategize which ones to go to is a different conversation, but you have to kind of set these away rotations up. And this is a standard known track. At each of these places, you get to know the programs, they get to know you, and then you have to have, it's a requirement to have a letter of recommendation from someone at that program, typically the program director or the chair of the program you rotate at, to accompany your application to neurosurgery residency. This is a very important piece of neurosurgery, and it's evolved this way in large part because neurosurgery is not only very competitive, but it's also very rigorous training. So the idea of it is that from both sides, you get to know another program. So when they get to know you, and you may be a match together, and you're more likely to match there if you like each other. So that's one good piece of it. The second good piece is that it makes sure that the trainee is interested in the training, right? Somebody just doesn't like the name neurosurgery and has never experienced it, and then they get into training and they realize they don't like it. So that de-risks it for both sides, that they are going to match someone that has seen this firsthand and lived it for probably at least 3 months of their life before they agree to go through the match. So that just makes sure everyone's on the same page. Mm-hmm. And then finally, it gives all the programs around the country a letter from someone who's seen you in person. So when you go interviewing around the country to the programs you haven't visited, it gives those programs an additional piece of information about how you performed in your previous rotations and would they want to take you. So if you get a letter from all these chairs and program directors typically know each other. So if you get a letter from, let's say Lawton, right? Or someone like that, and it's glowing, and that that follows you around to all your interviews. And so it makes a big difference on how people perceive you and your performance level.
That's great. That's Christopher, to start with you, just to kind of echo what Dr. Johnson has said, as well as your own thoughts about your experience, certainly as the chief resident, on the program side and on the student side, what your initial thoughts about sub-Is and their importance are.
Yeah, so thanks for the sort of the prompt, Michael. And I mean, Jeremiah summarized everything really well.
Yeah.
I can sort of highlight a few things that I think maybe being a little bit closer to the experience of having done them myself, but even more importantly, looking at them now through the lens of having watched 6 years worth of sub-Is come through
Right.
here at Mayo and getting a sense for what's the resident experience in terms of how are you trying to sort of select people and what helps people stand out both in a good way and potentially harms people who stand out in maybe not so favorable a way.
Right.
In terms of sort of the general principles, again, to echo what Jeremiah had said, it's really kind of non-negotiable that you do at least 1 or 2, ideally 3 rotations, a home program and 1 or 2 other ways. Obviously, as you alluded to earlier, the current situation with COVID, that's a qualified statement because nobody is doing rotations anywhere. But once they're back on the table, I think neurosurgery will be sort of the forefront of specialties that'll want people to start doing these again.
Right.
And there's a number of reasons for that. One of them is, signing up for a 7-year neurosurgery residency. It's a big deal. It's a big commitment. And people want people who are both committed to the specialty in general and who are going to be a good fit for their program in particular. And without spending a couple months kind of immersed in the culture, it can be very easy to make a wrong call. And I think that, there's sort of a separate conversation to be had that I don't think that we're going to get too much into today. That's figuring out, are you sure you want to be a neurosurgeon? And that's a really important question. And you have to be honest about it. And I have known several people who have left a neurosurgery residency by this point, people ahead of me, my year after me, who, fell in love with the idea of being a neurosurgeon in high school and college and medical school, whenever, and just kind of put their heads down and matched. And then a couple of years later came up for air and realized, like, my God, what have I done? This is a huge mistake. What a terrible fit for me. I don't want this life. And so spending a couple months immersed in the culture, it's sort of a last litmus test. If you are at the end of 3 months having a bad time every day, residency is going to be way worse and way harder and way more intense. And if you aren't psyched to go in as a student, the stakes are not negligible, but you're not actually responsible for taking care of patients. You're mostly just responsible for learning and picking up a little slack on the team here and there. Then you're probably not going to enjoy yourself as a resident. And it's a chance to kind of have a last opportunity to look at yourself in that context and say, is this a good fit? So that's one reason. I think it's valuable to help make that final decision. It's also the sub-Is are your yardstick for all the other experiences you're going to have as an applicant. And those are useful both to you looking at other programs and are useful as you talk to other people and try to figure out what programs are like. So a thing that I think is really important to keep in mind is, how do you go about selecting where are you going to go? And I'm kind of bringing this up for the reason that you want to pick programs that have a couple features. So one, you only want to rotate somewhere that you would actually want to match. And there are people out there who will tell you to, or who have decided to go to a particular program because they want to say it, or they think that the letter from a person there is going to make a big difference. And I don't think that that's really the case. I mean, neurosurgery is a small community. There are people at every institution who are very respected and who have friends and colleagues elsewhere, especially the academic world of neurosurgery.
Right.
So you're going to get a meaningful letter from almost any rotation that you would consider doing. But to waste a month of your life somewhere that you would never consider matching is a poor use of your time. And the people who are in the sub-I pool have a small competitive advantage, I think, against people who are from the applicant pool. And people who just interview. And I say this as someone who, I'm at Mayo, I wanted to be here, I love being here. I only interviewed here, I didn't rotate here. And so it's, people still end up matching almost every institution who are not from that program, who didn't rotate there. But now kind of from the chief side looking back, it is certainly the case that people who are known quantities, who show up for a month, who do a good job, who are easy to get along with, who are smart and show good judgment and communicate well, those people are kind of, they don't feel as risky. You still are only going to, there are other factors play into things, your grades and test scores, your research, does your personality fit with the program? Is it a place you want to be? And, do you get along with the other personalities that are there at the staff and the resident levels? But saying, I spent a month with this kid and he didn't drive me nuts, like that's a very big positive.
Right.
And you can hide a lot for 2 days while you do an interview.
Yeah.
And, people who are all-stars in interviews still get matched everywhere. And, I'm not saying that people should only screen those applicants, or that it's not a huge boost. It's the difference between like a B and a B plus. If that was, if you were getting a B otherwise, you might get a little bit of an extra credit for having shown up. Or, I think that people sometimes will, in making a rank list, kind of cluster groups of applicants together. Like these 5 were the all-stars, and then these next 5 were really amazing, and they had 1 or 2 things about them that maybe weren't, A+ material, but they were really great. And then, kind of down the list from there. And within a particular group, there are things that might move you up or down relative. You're not going to go from like group 3 to group 1 simply because you did a sub-I. But if you're someone in group 2, so to speak, and this is this is sort of an abstraction. This isn't what happens in Mayo or anywhere else. But like a version of this happens everywhere. Yeah. You may move up a little bit within your so-called group if you rotated somewhere and you performed well. Yeah. Another piece of bad advice that I think is out there a lot, in addition to rotating somewhere just to get a letter, is not rotating somewhere you really want to be. And I think that some particularly anxious medical students are afraid, oh no, what if I, say something off color, or I step on someone's toe, or I screw something up, and, I don't want to ruin my chances. And this is a little bit flip, I suppose, but I would say that, if you want to go into neurosurgery, you have to get comfortable with risk, and you got to get comfortable with risk early. And you have to be, you're going to be surrounded for your entire career by people who are very performance oriented, who are good at what they do, who take what they do seriously, who take patient care and excellence in patient care really seriously. And if you're not willing to say, like, I'm going to put myself out there and I'm going to do my best, and I'm confident that my best will stand up, and if I make a mistake, that I'm going to be able to make up for it, that I'm going to, be excellent in so many other ways, that if I, forget the chairman's name, or I, say the wrong answer to a diagnosis at some case conference or something like that, that's not going to be the thing that's remembered. That like me being great is going to be what's remembered. And, so I think that you got to go places where you would want to end up. And I guess the last thing I would say in all of that is it's good to try to pick places that are diverse. So, and what do I mean by that? Geographically, it's good to get in multiple regions. And again, like my own experience is kind of silly. Like I ended up rotating at Penn and Pittsburgh, and everyone was like, "Oh, you must really want to move to Pennsylvania." I was like, "No, this is just by accident." Like I had mentors at NYU who came from those programs and said, "These are really amazing places. You check them out." And I didn't think about sort of the consequences of that. Right. But I at least have my interviews. Someone asked me like, "What's up with Pennsylvania, man? Why are you spending 2 months there?" And so I think that if you're coming from the East or the West Coast and you are very interested in going to the opposite coast, rotating there gets you taken seriously. So that's a good thing to, and if you're really wanting to be taken seriously at sort of a small program or an out of the way program or somewhere that has something unusual about it, showing up there, showing up in the region, visiting it in some capacity is a very useful thing to do. And then the other thing is people, and these are sort of false definitions in a sense, but people tend to put most programs into a couple big buckets where there's places that are quote unquote academic or quote unquote clinical, where, the emphasis of the culture is, are you doing a lot of operating early on in a more clinical program? Are the case volumes higher? Is resident autonomy more sort of baked into the thing? Versus, is everyone going in a lab? Is everyone getting a grant for their research year? Is, everyone who wants to have a lab and an academic job and a K award within the first 3 years of graduation getting one? And there are philosophical differences in how some programs are run. it's a spectrum.
Right.
There isn't just you flip a switch and everyone is A or B, but it's useful to have programs that have different flavors to them. And it gives you, again, when you go out and you interview at 15 different places, having a sense for, I was at this place that was very academic, and these are the things that I liked about it and the things that I didn't like it. And I was at this other place that was very clinical. These are the things that I liked and I didn't like about it. It gives you a wider understanding of the possibilities for what training programs can look like and what curricula can look like and what resident experiences can look like. And then you can fit every other program into that matrix and sort of get a sense for where does that fall for you and your desires and your priorities and all of that. So that's kind of a long-winded answer with a lot of information in it, but does that kind of hit the highlights for you?
No, it was great. And the thing you last said was, I thought was it was provocative, was that, when you go on these, because you only can go to 3 to 4. I mean, you could do 8 in a year, but you would be insane to do that unless you're really worried about your chances. But I think that there's having your experience, certainly on Sub-I, the 3 or 4 programs that you go to, having your experience at those institutions, whether they were what you thought were not, having them as your lens for your interview season, being able to learn a lot about different programs and different styles, whether they be academic, clinical, whatever the spectrum, wherever they are on the spectrum, but applying some of those principles on your interview so that you can ask, well thought out questions so you can really get a good view of the program in those 2 days.
And also so you can converse with other applicants.
Right.
And, those are your best resource. And, people, sort of a funny footnote in this whole Sub-I thing that, again, we won't get into too much here, is that, be cool to the other Sub-Is, be a good citizen. I know that at some point we're going to kind of get into the sort of do's and don'ts of things, but your other co-applicants, yes, ostensibly you are competing with them, but like most people who have good applications are going to do well. You're going to get in somewhere great. You're trying to find a good fit, and you are each other's resources. And I mean, I can say very earnestly, Mayo was my last interview. I had a little 2-day trip plan where I went to Iowa and here, and I was very serious. I was so burnt out. I considered canceling both of them. And if it were not for the co-applicants who I was friends with, who I'd met at interviews, who had rotated here, who had said such incredible things about it that made me really feel like I got to go out there, I got to see what this place is all about, I wouldn't have shown up and I would have ended up at a different program because I wouldn't have even ranked this place. And I've had a spectacular experience here. And I knew after coming here that it was a place I really wanted to end up. So there's a lot of value in being able to talk about your Sub-I experiences and other people's, and you may not even end up wanting to stay at one of the places where you rotated, but being able to tell other people about it, it's a good citizenship act, basically. Right. Like you're helping other people try to figure out what's a good fit for them. You're helping those programs figure out what's a good fit for them. At the end of the day, like you kind of got to believe in the match, and you kind of got to hope that we're all going to end up at a place that is good for us and our personality and our career goals. And one way to facilitate that is by, participating in this Sub-I project process, and then being kind of honest and open about discussing your experiences with the other applicants. And that's the kind of thing that can happen behind closed doors. It's to say, right, like, you don't have to do that in the lunchroom with a bunch of residents around. In fact, I would encourage you not to be the someone at an interview talking smack about some place that you just spent a month. But if there was somewhere that you had a negative experience, or even a very positive experience, but you were just surprised by something that you were like, oh, this is really different than my home program. Is it like that where you're from? Do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing? Like those are valuable conversations to build a sense for, your understanding of how neurosurgery training works and how you want it to work for you.
Joey, do you anything that you would want to echo, disagree with, agree with? Certainly, as your perspective as a junior resident, you recently went through this process and now you have that experience fresh in your mind, as well as now being on the other side. Your perspective is unique. Do you have any thoughts off of what Christopher said?
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what he said. Ultimately, while I was going through the process, I reached out to him and got a lot of that same advice because, ultimately, neurosurgery is a community that, as medical students, you're about to enter into, and it's a wonderful, beautiful community, and it's really a lot of fun. And so there's a lot of help. Like I said, Christopher helped me a lot throughout the process. But I completely agree. I think that going to sub-Is that you actually think that you have a desire to go to is really important. So I ended up doing my home sub-I and then 3 away rotations, which is a little more than I think average. But all 3 of the places I went to were places I was very seriously considering and very much enjoyed. All 3 experiences for very different reasons. And again, similar to what Christopher said, I think that there's a lot of benefit in diversifying. I think one of the other things, so he talked about academic and kind of clinical based and the diversity of location. I think something else that maybe isn't talked about quite as much in a forum like this, but is often talked about kind of behind closed doors is there's intensity levels of programs. There are programs that are known to be very intense and, you work really, really, really hard. And there are programs that are known to have a less intense atmosphere. And that was something else that I personally wanted to know. University of Michigan, where I am and where I knew, is not known to be a particularly intense program in terms of you're never going to get yelled at from an attending. It's a very supportive collegial atmosphere. So I felt like I had a very good sense for that type of program. And in my sub-Is, I wanted to see other programs, see different intensity levels, because ultimately, the next 7 years, you're going to come into that culture and be working at that intensity level. And so I wanted to be able to get those different senses. And that was something that was really helpful for me during my sub-Is, is seeing that diversity of programs. But ultimately, I think probably the most important thing that Christopher said was the importance of your co-sub-Is and co-applicants. I learned a ton from the people that I interviewed with, I rotated with. I obviously am still in communication with a lot of them. And it was actually just texting a couple of them last night, seeing how their second year is going. And it's a really important part of the process. And for those people who are going through, COVID, it's something that will have to be done in a different manner, more online and through social media. But getting the opinions of those around you and starting to build your network and your group is one of the best parts about sub-Is, is you really start developing that kind of posse that you're going to be with for the rest of your career.
Right. Would you agree with that, Dr. Johnson? Would you say that?
I think everything that Chris and
you
Joey
got your posse.
Yeah, everything that Chris and Joey said is correct. I mean, as I've moved along in age, the posse has changed as you go through residency. I think maybe Joey, when he's a PGY-7, his posse will much more closely resemble his co-residents. But you still keep in touch with these people, but it's just that as the years distance you, it's just harder and harder to be really, really close compared to people you see every day and go through battle with, so to speak. But I do agree that those people are your colleagues and your generation, and you want to treat them well because you'll be seeing them for a long time.
That's great. Yeah. I think each of you touched on a little bit about things that students should be doing while they're on service. Are there particular, Christopher, you had said earlier that we're going to get to do's and don'ts, and I don't want to frame it in just that, this is what you should do, this is what you should not do. Obviously, there's a lot of room for interpretation, whether depending on the student or the program, but what are some things that whether you're evaluating students or when you are on your sub-Is, are things that you think all students should know, whether they be cliches or hidden secrets or whatever? What are some things that you think all students should be cognizant of once they get into a program where they do really want to be there? And that's where they would love to train for the next 7 years.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I have a bunch of thoughts about it. I'm sure you're surprised to hear.
No, I want to hear them.
Before I forget, one thing that Joey mentioned that I want to call back to is the intensity concept is an interesting one, and that's another part of the sort of figuring out what's out there, what are different sort of flavors of training program, what's a good fit for you, and a really important aspect of that to think about, or at least what was for me, is there are places where you get on a conveyor belt and you are going to be forced to do certain things. And there are people for whom that is very beneficial. We're having heavy-handed mentorship. We're having specific goals with like well-defined, objective endpoint. You will have X number of papers a year, or you will have X number of dollars in grants by this year, or whatever, where that kind of motivation and that kind of structure is very helpful. And it's okay to be honest about recognizing if you're the kind of person who's going to benefit from that. I am not the kind of person who benefits from that. I find that sort of like, iron-handed authority a little bit stifling. And I wanted to be in an environment that was a little bit more, here are the resources. We expect you to do the most you can with them, but we're not here to baby you and hold your hand. You need to figure it out. And some people will swim. Some people will tread water. Some people will drown. And it's good to get
We're glad to know that you haven't drowned yet.
Yeah, not yet. I got 9 months left, there's something to be said at almost every step of this process for being honest with yourself. And that'll be true through your entire training, that, you're going to be good at some things and bad at some things. And there are some things you are naturally inclined to succeed at, and others that you're going to have to work extra hard. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't do those, but set yourself up for success as much as you can. And being a little bit more rigorous about your sort of self-examination early in the process pays off in a big way down the road. Anyway, to your actual question about sort of what are the pearls that I think I would impart to medical students who are getting on this sub-I bus. I came up with a line years ago. I think I was a medical student at the time. It was sort of towards the end of that medical student is basically it's like a vocabulary class followed by a dance lesson. That it's all about figuring out what to say and where to stand. And I think that kind of holds true today. And a lot of what you're figuring out how to do as a sub-I is like where to stand. Like you want to be in a position that you're seen, that if someone needs help, you're right there ready to help them, that you have a good view to see what's going on, to learn, to absorb, but you're not in the way. And I mean this both practically in terms of like standing in between the person who's operating and the scrub tech is a stupid place to stand because you're going to impede the operation and it could be dangerous, or you're just going to annoy somebody. And also in the sort of metaphorical sense of, you want to be someone who asks a smart question at a moment when everyone is prepared to receive a question. You don't want to be someone who is constantly, you are in everyone's face all the time because you are asking so many questions in moments when people are trying to focus on another thing that it seems like you're standing in the middle of the room when someone else is giving a talk. And that's kind of an awkward thing to do.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, I think about things in very practical terms in spite of all the weird metaphors. And like, be on time. If possible, be early, always stay late. If there's a case going on, you should probably be there and at least, watching, ideally scrubbing, offer to help scrub, offer to close, with the caveat that if you are ever told to leave by a resident, you should leave. You can ask once, are you sure? You don't need anything? There's nothing I can do? Is there someone else I should go check with? Should I go see who's on call tonight? Like you can put a clarifying question in there.
Back to that dance.
But if someone tells you, no, I'm serious, get out of here, I promise you there's a good reason. And it's either that case is going to be a total show that you don't want to be trapped in for the next 8 hours, or maybe someone's in a bad mood and they don't want you to have to be the person who's around and who's, they're introduced to them when they're going to by default formulate a negative opinion, or maybe they're just, we're going to have to hit the gas and go here. And you're going to, be 4 feet away from a wound and, try not to fall asleep on your feet all night. And like, there are times when, and these are rare. I mean, I can think of maybe 2 times in 6 years that I've told a student, like, I would strongly advise that you go home now. Like this is a, you know, I tend to encourage people to stay as long as, you know, possible, and as long as there's still something educational, it's good to be there.
Right.
But it's a bad sign if someone who's applying for the job of intern is not able to take simple directions and things like, we're done for the day, there's nothing left to do, I just got paperwork, go to sleep, or go write a paper, or go read, or whatever. Right. So, you know, be present, but if you're encouraged to be present somewhere else, I would take that advice.
A lot of common sense.
Yeah, you got to know your patients, and this is true from all of medical school. And you know, it doesn't need to be an extreme. I mean, no one's going to ask you like their nickname from junior high, but you should, if you're showing up to an operating room, you're expected to know, I would say, what's the disease, what's the basic surgical plan. You don't need to know the nuanced detail between, oh, we're doing a retrosig instead of a translab for this particular reason. If you do, that's great. That's awesome. Those are things to aspire to learn. But you need to know, like, the plan today is we're going to do a retrosig and take out a vestibular schwannoma. If you have access to the medical record, read the staff's note. Like, read the last clinic note that says, here's the surgical plan and here's why. You can learn a ton from doing it. And it also makes you look like someone who cares, which is important. In terms of knowledge-based stuff, I would say that anatomy and imaging are fair game, and no one expects you to know everything, but you will be asked questions about those kind of things.
Right.
And if you don't know, don't make something up. Say, I don't know, or say, I'll look that up later, or one of those other, you know, weird things we're all taught to say. But I would focus more of your time and attention in sort of reading and studying on just knowing basic anatomy, knowing basic imaging features. You know, on every rotation I've had, and with most of the sub-Is who spent time with me sort of on the other end of the thing, you know, I've gone through, you know, question and answer sessions where you'll say, what's this? What's that? You know, here we are, you know, the staff has left the room, the case is over, you know, let me show you around. And, you know, here's the CP angle. Do you know what nerve this is? Do you know what artery that is? Like, and again, it's usual. Most people aren't jerks. Most neurosurgeons are nice people, in spite of, you know, popular misconceptions. No one is, or most people are not trying to like grill you to prove you wrong. They're just trying to get a sense for what you know and what you don't. And a lot of us tend to think it's fun. I mean, I love anatomy and I love thinking about anatomy and teaching anatomy. And I think it's nice to have those sort of engaged discussions with students. But, you know, getting too fussy about sort of the details of exactly what's going to be done in a procedure, because there's so much diversity and there's so much person-to-person variability. That's not always a good use of your time. Having a you know, 10,000 foot view of the plan, you know, we're doing a fusion today, levels, you know, L1 to 5, this is the diagnosis. That's all you need to know. But, you know, someone's going to ask you, you know, what's the PARS? Do you know? Or, you know, do you know what our landmarks are for starting a pedicle screw? And those are good things to try to have an understanding of. And you'll never know everything. I don't know everything. I know so little, but that's kind of the fun of this.
So do you recommend like, you know, like trying to do a neuroradiology rotation before your sub-I? I mean, do you think that would be valuable?
If you can, that's great, but most people can't. And I certainly wouldn't do that instead of doing a home neurosurgery rotation or filling any of your core rotations out. There's a lot of great stuff online. There's a handful of websites where you can just run through cases. There's some nice videos on YouTube. There's a ton of great neuroradiologists on Twitter. One of my favorite academic medicine websites where you can learn a lot and in tiny little amounts of time. But yeah, I would
put
use
links to some of those stuff.
Resources. And there's an article I wrote with a couple of my co-residents a few years ago. It's called Non-Required Reading Clinical Neurosurgery 101 or something like that. It's in World Neurosurgery, where we basically go through like 10 or 12 basic books that are sort of what I thought were what I would tell intern me to read. And why I think they're really useful. And anyone listening to this who's looking for stuff that I think is useful to study, the reason I wrote that was to give people a guide for this stage of things, to like, here are, and it's not even all books, you know, some of it is like, use the Roten collection to learn your anatomy. And there's actually everything for the most part that we're talking about today is also, there was Jeremiah can correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was winter 2018, there was a newsletter article that kind of hit the same highlights of this. So if you want to go back and read another version of what we're saying today, that
we'll put links to some of that stuff.
Yeah. Absolutely.
for people who are interested in diving into that, because I think a lot of people would. I think people are yearning for some of those pragmatic answers, because there's a lot of just like, because it is such a highly specialized field, there's it's hard to know exactly
it's
where
overwhelming.
to start.
I mean, there's just so much out there that you could read. I
Right.
still today feel somewhat overwhelmed by it, and I've read a lot, but that article should give you a good start for things.
That's great.
The other thing that I would just say before I forget, on the to-do thing, have a talk that's short, like about 10 minutes, that if asked, you could condense to 5 or expand to 20, because at some point during most rotations, you're going to be asked to give a brief presentation. Best case scenario, it should be on research of yours. If it's not, it should at least be on an interesting patient that you could then do some teaching about a weird disease. And whatever time block you're given, that is the most you should talk for. And this is true when you're a resident, this is true when you're a staff. No one in neurosurgery will ever begrudge you finishing your talk early. Like, we all have things to do. We all want to get out of the lecture. Like, if you finish your 10-minute talk in 8 minutes, everyone's going to love you. Like, don't insist on giving your 20-minute talk in 15 minutes when you're told to give 10, because again, you look like someone who's not paying attention, and and you're making people late to the OR.
Simple directions. Whatever. What are some things that, day one you should know? And I think Christopher touched on a lot of that. And then how would you gauge your success on day 30 or 60 after spending that amount of time on a service? I think a lot of people, they don't really, they might get evaluated in real time, or they have an interview with the program at the end, or that sort of thing. But because we don't really know what we're doing, it's hard to know exactly if we were successful. And obviously matching is the best indicator. But what are some things that we should know at day 30 or day 60 about neurosurgery, and then how we should gauge our success after being on that service?
Yes, that's a great question. I would say I would agree with a lot of what Christopher said in terms of what we need to know day one. You want to be able to know, basic radiology. You want to be able to catch blood on a CT. You want to be able to differentiate a tumor. You want to be able to have some basic knowledge of MRI sequences and what you're looking for in different sequences, those kinds of things. And you want to be able to know basic anatomy. Again, I don't think that many people would expect you to be able to, get too detailed as a medical student, but certainly being able to have an understanding of where you are during an operation. And if you don't know, being able to ask intelligent questions that let people know that you're really thinking through the prior knowledge that you have and trying to add on to it. And I think most people don't begrudge medical students that, if they can tell that you're really actively trying to learn with them, as long as you have that base knowledge. And then, like Christopher said, I can't overemphasize the importance on day one of just being yourself and having common sense. The reality is neurosurgeons are busy. They are high-performing people, and they tend to be, they want to get the day done. They have a lot to do. And when, their ORs are done at 7, they have papers to write, they have papers to review, they have committees they need to talk on. And, at some point they may want to see their wife and kids or their husband.
Podcast they need to record.
Or podcasts they need to record, exactly. So ultimately, it takes a lot to just use that common sense and act the way that you would assume someone would want you to act. On day 30, day 60, I got into a habit. I don't know if it was annoying or not, but when I was on sub-Is, especially if I felt like I was getting to know some of the residents, or felt like I was developing a good relationship with them, I often was quite blunt, and halfway through the sub-I would just say, hey, you know what? I'm trying to make sure that I'm doing a good job, that I'm improving. Are there any specific things that you notice that I'm doing that is good, things that I'm doing that are poor, things that I need to change? And there are certainly a few times that kind of, the resident was like, oh, I don't really have anything for you. But more times than not, I think the resident was appreciative that I was trying to figure out what I was doing wrong, or what I was doing right. And I got some really good feedback. And so I think that you can self-gauge in that way. I think that, again, talking to your co-sub-Is is really helpful. A lot of times they're able to give you a good sense on how you're doing, being able to bounce ideas off of them. And I don't think that you're probably going to be asking the chair of a program that you're rotating at how you're doing. And you're probably not going to get a ton of pointed feedback from them. You may, but that's probably going to be less likely. I would say that the best way to gauge yourself is how you're interacting with the residents, how they seem when they're around you. Are they working to teach you? You know, I had one resident who I specifically remember this case where we were doing a spinal fusion together, and he was getting on me and he was saying, "Hey Joe, you need to be anticipating this, you need to be doing that, you need to be working towards this." And after the case, you know, he was like, "You know, I'm kind of riding on you because I think that you can do better, and I think that you have potential." And because I was developing that relationship with this particular resident, yeah, I felt like I was probably doing a decent job on the rotation. He had noticed me and that kind of thing. And I think that more often than not, as medical students, you're able to get that feedback from residents and have a sense for where you are.
I think, yeah, not taking things personally, you know, if they're on you, there's a good chance they're probably invested in you. If they're not talking to you, that's not a good sign.
Yeah, in neurosurgery, I don't think you can ever really take something personally, even if it's meant personally. It's important to realize that everyone's trying to help you improve, and if they're not, you can still take it as ways to improve. So never take anything personally. Always take it in the mentality of this is an opportunity for me to grow, improve, and just keep getting better.
Yeah.
And get used to feedback just being a part of your normal process early on.
Right.
You know, it's the whole, like, residency is, in theory at least, you know, going to be 7 years of you getting sequential opportunities to basically screw up on someone else's watch and learn from what you screwed up and then not make that same mistake again. And, you know, I tell all the juniors and all the medical students, it's okay to make mistakes. It's good to make mistakes. Like, you learn from mistakes. Those are things that you won't forget, most of the time at least. What's not okay is making the same mistake twice, or what's not okay is making a mistake and then not learning from it and not, being thoughtful about what could I have done better, and, what are the steps to make sure that I don't make this particular mistake in the future. You know, if you find yourself in a situation on a sub-I where you feel like you underperformed in some way, not in the moment, but afterwards, later that day, the next day, later in the rotation, try to find one of the more junior residents who was involved in it and ask, like, hey, could I debrief about this with you? Another sort of thing that's, tied to the sort of the big picture dues of a good rotation, try to figure out who your chiefs are going to be, and try to figure out, for most programs, that's the PGY-5s. Sometimes it's the 4s. There's a little bit of variability. Our program, it's a little bit flexible because some of us do achieve year 6, some is 7s. But try to get a sense for who those people might be. And if you can, because oftentimes they'll be on research years, try to set a meeting with them. And you could ask them something like, what do you think makes a great resident? What are the sort of things that you're looking for in a junior? And, is there anything that you could give me in terms of advice and how to work towards that, whether I end up here or somewhere else? I want to succeed, and I hope that we're going to be colleagues someday, and I'd really appreciate your insight. And I think that kind of thoughtful approach to things will, if someone has feedback to give you, it gives them the opportunity to do it without kind of forcing the issue. And if nothing else, it shows that you're trying to reach out to people who would be your primary educators, the people who are the most responsible for you, and try to build a little bit of a relationship with them. I always appreciated it when the students introduced themselves and kind of went out of their way to say, like, hey, I know you're on your research year, but are you going to conference, or, are you going to be in the OR any days? Is there any way we could connect? And I think that's helpful.
So I'd kind of like to just switch gears just a little bit. Dr. Johnson, do you have any thoughts about kind of everything that's been said at this point? Certainly your faculty position has a unique perspective on some of this stuff.
I mean, there's a lot of directions you can go. I mean, we could talk about this for hours. I mean, I think all these the points everyone has made are essentially nail on the head. I mean, just absolutely nail on the head. The other thing that I would mention is that you want to be, it's almost, Chris almost made this comment just a moment ago, and it's like, what are the characteristics of students that faculty and residents are looking to match, right? And you want to be that person, not just because you want to fake it until you make it, but you like want to become that person. Right. So let me ask Joey, like, Joey, what are you looking for in a medical student who rotates in your service and that you would love to match in your program? What are you looking for? What are the characteristics?
I mean, ultimately, I'm looking for someone who is hardworking, who is able to take feedback well, and who's honest, because it comes up all the time where a faculty member says, hey, did you look at, the INR for this patient? And maybe you didn't. And you can't say, oh yeah, it's probably normal. I want someone who is honest, is willing to tell me when they do something and when they don't. And overall, it's just pleasant. No one wants to work with a complainer, someone who the world is out to get them, someone who's pleasant and is willing to work hard.
How about you, Chris?
I agree with everything Joey said. I think I would add to that someone who just absolutely loves neurosurgery, and everyone hears some version of the sort of pat saying about like, if you can be happy doing anything else, like you probably should be. I would almost put that on its head and say, if you are every day as a student, every day as a resident, getting up and getting excited to go to the OR to do at least most of the cases, to take care of neurosurgery patients. It's a very unique world, and it's a weird world, and it has things about it that are amazing, that are challenging, that are difficult. But if it doesn't get you excited, you're not as much fun to teach, and you're not as much fun to be around. And so I tend to look for people who are passionate about the field in general. It's good to have interest. I think that most medical students are fairly unformed, and I honestly distrust people who say like, oh, well, I'm going to be a deformity surgeon, and subspecialized in, sacral chordomas. Like, that's a little too much sense for where you're going to be in like 10 or 15 years. And I say this as someone who I think I ended up about where I thought I was going to, but there have been so many things as a resident that I've loved way more than I thought I was going to. And I'm like, spine's a great example. Like I hated spine as a medical student because you're, feet away from the incision and you can't see anything, and you get turned into like the accessory scrub tech for an hour. And, there's nothing like, they're not the most gratifying experiences, and they tend to be very long. But like, it's super fun to do spine surgery as a resident, and, developing the skill of like putting pedicle screws in and really getting to understand that 3D anatomy, particularly in the context of deformity surgery, is super cool. And like, I love that that's a thing that like I've learned and I can do now. And so I think everyone has to have an open mind about, not sort of saying, oh, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. Like, you want to come into neurosurgery with a sort of as unformed a perspective as possible. And it's okay to have interests, and it's okay to say, oh, I've been writing this paper about pituitaries. I think they're really cool. Like that's great. And I guess I'm saying you got to kind of walk a line between articulating interest without pigeonholing yourself. And I think the most important thing above all is teachability. And I have, Joey kind of alluded to this, I haven't come up with a metric for, I want to be like the Angela Duckworth of teachability, like, because grit is a cool thing, an interesting thing, and it's different than that. And what I'm kind of getting at is I would take someone who knows nothing, but who I only have to teach each thing once, over someone who comes in with more knowledge than, more skill than an average PGY-2 or 3, but who you're going to have to beat it into their head to like close this way, not that way, or, this is how you manage an EVD and subarachnoid hemorrhage or whatever. Like someone who is able to take critical feedback, integrate it, improve quickly, and who's very dedicated to their own self-improvement. Those are the people who are the all-stars, and who inspire you to be a better teacher and aspire you to want to give them more resources and give them more tools, because you see them accelerating in their abilities and their learning. And someday I'm going to figure out how to assess for teachability and just match those people to whatever program I end up in. But,
teachability score, validate it.
Yeah, something like that.
That's great.
Thanks. I think I would add to all those things, just to kind of summarize it, is I think you get a very similar set of characteristics from a lot of people that have watched students succeed or fail, or have had to train people that were more or less receptive, right? So I think the core things you have to be, you're honest and hardworking. I mean, I think you can go nowhere without those things, two things. You're probably not in medical school unless you're bright enough to do it, like to learn. But there are some barriers to being teachable. I think that's an incredibly smart thing that Chris said about the teachability piece. So one thing that makes you not teachable is like being arrogant. You know, another thing that makes you not teachable is just not picking up basic information well. This isn't really for you. No matter how many times I teach you to do this procedure, you're just not going to pick it up. And that's another thing that sub-Is help, is that everyone gets a sense of these things. And I think honest, hardworking, what attendings really want, more than spectacular academic talent, and we want that, but you have to be safe, honest, and hardworking to make it. Like if you don't know something, you have to be able to say, hey, I don't know how to do this. You have to be on. That's part of it, is honesty. I mean, this is the core competency to take care of patients when you're not around. Attendings trust the care of their patients and their reputation, and in some cases, their medical legal liabilities to residents. So you're looking for these characteristics of someone you can trust taking care of your patient explicitly without having to worry all day and all night that they're going to, put in an EVD when they're not capable and they just didn't want to bring it up. And they had to be, honest, teachable, trainable, and trustworthy.
We could almost end there, honestly. I do think there's some value in talking a little bit about the interview process, maximizing that time, just spending a little bit. There's obviously a lot of parallel here. I think there's two places that I in my conversations with other students, the resident dinner, I think that's a big one. I think a lot of people are trying to make an impression in a short amount of time. And if there's anything that you guys have thoughts there, and then just what questions in an interview should students be looking to get answered? Certainly if they didn't rotate on those services within those programs. So Joey, I'd start with you.
Yes, I personally, I think the resident dinner is one of the more important parts, if not the most important part of the interview for the medical students. It's super important to be able to see the culture and the people that you're going to be working with for the next 7 years. Because again, in the end, most programs boil down to a fairly similar course of what you're going to be doing over the next 7 years. But it's the people that really changes the experience. I would say that it's important to act yourself, with a couple caveats. Again, you're applying for a very important and serious profession where people's lives are in your hands, and so it's not necessarily the night that you want to test out how much you can drink or how drunk you can get or how loud you can be. I think that the applicants who have kind of rubbed me the wrong way during interview dinners are people who spend a lot of time talking about themselves and end up kind of cutting out their co-interviewees. Don't let them talk or bring everything that their co-interviewee says back to some achievement that they made. It goes back to being humble, being a team player. These are all important concepts within neurosurgery. And so I think those are all important things for applicants to be thinking of. I feel like there's a second part to your question.
No, that's great. And I think that answers the broader question of just making an impression, showing that you are humble, not making a strong impression for the wrong reasons, that sort of thing. The second question was just more about, like, from a student perspective, what are some things that we should answer that we might not be able to answer as thoroughly as we would on a sub-I?
Oh, that there was something that just a quick thing. When I interviewed at Cleveland Clinic, Dr. Benzel, who was sitting across from me, said, it was my first interview. And I remember him saying, I want you, for all the rest of your interviews, to try to look in the eyes of the residents and see if they're happy. See if they look dead inside or if they look happy. And that was something that I really took to heart. There are programs where I think that residents tend to be really happy and really love what they're doing, like Christopher's been talking about. And there's places where that may not be every resident's kind of experience. And I think that as an applicant, it's really important to take a look at those try to look into the residents' eyes and just see what they're experiencing.
They'll signal it to you if they're unhappy. I mean, some people explicitly told me when I asked them about research, and they would say, "Oh, well, go ask that person that's research, year got sliced because they needed more clinical help or whatever." And you'll get the sense. I mean, if you love the program, that was like a one-off thing. They're not going to say that, So,
right.
No.
It's also, to get back to the sub-I thing, it's a good thing to ask people who rotated there.
Yes.
Because again, a night where like the department's paying for everyone who's willing to get off their butt to show up and, eat and drink at a restaurant, sometimes with their families and their friends and whatever else, you can hide a lot for a night, for a dinner, etc.
Right.
Ask someone who rotated there. Like, are they happy? Are they like this all the time? What's the community like? What's the culture like? And I guess there's, those things change over time. In the 6.5 years I've been here, like the general mood of this program has shifted in some ways, but it hasn't changed dramatically because most programs tend to pick people who want to be in that kind of environment and who want to participate in the kind of culture that already exists there. And so even though there are big overarching trends that you can to a degree select for or against, you, for the most part, a good example is like, we tend to get people who are excited or at least tolerant about living in, a pretty cold, pretty small town here. Like Rochester, Minnesota is not for everyone. And you could say the same of New York. Like I came from NYU. Like
that's my vacation spot is Rochester.
Yeah, I mean, mine too.
Every weekend.
Especially these days.
Yeah, right.
The only Olmsted County is the only place in Minnesota without a natural lake. 10,000 of them and 0 here. It's can't vacation in Olmsted. You got to go next door.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's
another thing you can do is count residents at interview dinner. If there's less than 75% show up, that's a problem.
Yeah.
There's lots of things.
Yeah, that's a huge negative indicator.
Huh. Interesting.
So to your earlier question, I guess I would say that something that's very important to me, and others may dispute this, I think it's okay to be yourself. In fact, I would even say it's important to be yourself. Don't be a freak show. You don't have to be your weirdest, most esoteric self. And again, I say this is a fairly weird, fairly esoteric person. But here's a really good example. I decided I was not going to shave my beard for any of my residency interviews because if somewhere was not going to match me because I had facial hair, I don't want to work in that department. And I think that's okay. And, if these are people you're going to spend 7 years working with, you want to at least give them a little peek of who you're going to be. It's okay to tell a joke every now and then. Just don't tell, a bad joke or, a really inappropriate joke, etc. Read the room, use good judgment. You guys know what I'm saying.
Right.
Similarly, I do think it's okay to relax a little bit, particularly if there's an event with just residents. If you're someone who drinks, it's okay to have a drink or two. If you're invited to go out to a bar after the dinner, you should go and socialize, participate in whatever you are able to participate in, but try not to become a trail legend. You don't want to be someone who participated so enthusiastically that you don't remember what you participated in and maybe other people will hear about it in the future. That's not a great look. It makes you seem like someone who has bad judgment, if nothing else.
Right. People can tell when you come to interviews hungover. Or late. Yeah, not a good look.
Yeah, you have to be super cool to pull that look off. Yeah. And most people in neurosurgery are not super cool.
Maybe you can shave.
Yeah. I think it's really important to be able to talk about things that are not neurosurgery. And I also think it's really important, and Joey alluded to this, and I will slam this nail in. Don't just talk about yourself. You ask the residents about themselves, ask the staff about themselves, ask them about the town, ask them about activities, ask them about their families. It's like going on a date. And if you don't know what I mean by that, then I'm not sure how to improve the advice. But you want to, if you just spend the whole time talking about yourself, you won't go on a lot of second dates.
That's right.
And then the last thing I would say is a lot of it is sort of individualized. That the best program for me is not the best program for Michael or Joey or Jeremiah. You are an individual who has discrete, specific needs. You need to be honest about what those are. Most of them fall into 3 big categories. Or sort of, what are you looking for in clinical training? What are you looking for in sort of academics, research, the sort of paraclinical space. And then there's the like geography, lifestyle, personal stuff. Some people are very committed to a particular location, either for personal reasons or family reasons, etc. Some people are willing to move everywhere. Some people want to be somewhere warm or cold or whatever. I think all of that is should be secondary, but that's my opinion. I was someone who was like, the academic and clinical stuff mattered a little bit more to me, but there were certain places that I didn't really interview because I knew that I would be unhappy there. So you need to ask questions that kind of fill in the gaps on, okay, I'm looking to live in this kind of a town. Is this place like that? I'm looking to be in an environment that like protects a research year, but like for real protects a research year. Do they do that here? And, those are good things to ask about in the sort of more hair let down environment at the dinner. You can try to find some of the residents and say what a typical research years look like, if that was something that was very important to you.
That's great.
So you use it to do information gathering.
Yeah.
And again, and target people who sub-eyed there. And you can crossbreed these conversations across interviews. At this interview, you may be sitting next to the guy who sub-eyed at the place you just came from, and you didn't get some information there. And he's a great person to ask, like, hey, I just came from program X, and I didn't really figure out what their like research year structure like is like. How often do they get pulled for clinical duties or cover the OR, call or whatever? And they'll have a meaningful answer, usually, at least something better than what you got out of the 2 days. And take advantage of those opportunities and and get to know people. Joey mentioned this earlier. This is your posse long term. I'm still very tight with a handful of guys from the very first interview I went on. Yeah,
that's cool.
It's a good time. Take advantage of it.
Yeah. Try to enjoy it and where you can.
And introduce yourself with both names. This is another pet peeve of mine. Like everyone, you have a first name and a last name, and this is a professional setting. Like I'm Christopher Graffeo. I'm not Chris. Like and it's okay. Like at a casual setting, I don't want that. That comes across as a little bit of a jerk. But like what I'm saying is like introduce yourself to people. There's a lot of people named Chris out there, so maybe I'm particularly sensitive to this, but I think it's good to make sure that people get both of your names when you're introducing yourself. And maybe someday we'll introduce ourselves by both of our names and our Twitter handles or something like that.
Bob Vance, Vance Refrigeration or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And as a footnote to that, all of you medical students out there, I've been waiting to plug this for a million years. Please take aspiring neurosurgeon out of your Twitter bio. That sounds ridiculous. Say, interested in neurosurgery or something, but like aspiring neurosurgeon is it's a little hoity-toity. I'm tired of it. I'm one man, in my opinion, with a big ass grain of salt, but like I don't think anyone should say that they're self-identifying as an aspiring neurosurgeon.
I think I had that.
And you still match. So like I said,
I hear everyone going to their Twitters right now.
It doesn't mean much, but I think it sounds
Twitter.
Silly. Let's put it that way.
This isn't a side, but my favorite pet peeve about Twitter is all the ways people try to do gymnastics to make it look like they're not promoting themselves and they're promoting themselves. Like, proud to have been invited to give this talk or this kind of thing.
We're very fortunate, humbled.
Humbled. Yeah.
Humbled is the big
so
one.
humbled.
Hashtag humble brag.
Well,
this finally degenerated into a real podcast.
That's what it is. Yeah.
So I wanted to add a few things about those comments about how to behave on interview dinner and the night before dinner and these things, which is that I think all these tells about not talking about yourself too much, not being teachable, they all come back to one thing what everybody's looking for, which is like essentially your emotional intelligence, right? Like the insight into yourself. So I had a recent conversation with the program director, and they gave actually the medical students that just finished their rotation the ability to grade themselves. And then all the program director and the associate program director and a couple more faculty graded them. And they said that it was quite interesting to see sometimes that occasionally there's a major disparity where the applicant thought way more of themselves than everyone else did. And it kind of goes into insight, right? Where are your limitations? How, honesty, all these different things are all kind of all intertangled together in this evaluation system. And some of the tells are arrogance, talking about your TOEFL all the time, that you may be in that spectrum that doesn't really fully absorb or able to be honest with himself, as Chris says. I mean, there's a lot of these things that are overlapping themes. So that's just kind of one other little comment I would make. So don't be the person that's not teachable, directable, can't learn, thinks that they're the greatest, no one can dissuade them from it. Be the person that's humble, is themselves, but themselves aren't a train wreck of unrealistic things that they say about themselves,
Right. Yeah. If you're a medical student, you probably didn't earn all fives.
Yeah. But you also want to be careful not to say outrageous things. Like
Right.
there was a particular person that I know that has claimed that they were only going to rank places that were on beaches, or only I'm going to rank only places in one city. If you want to go to neurosurgery, you're gonna have to be willing to go anywhere to train to do it. And that's what the kind of dedication people want to hear. You may have family reasons that you're rooting to stay in one place, but I don't know if you can only tell people you're only going to rank places in one city or one region and be taken kind of seriously, in my opinion.
Yeah. And even if you are, you gain nothing by disclosing that
by
information.
Telling that, right.
It makes you look closed-minded, unenthusiastic, short-sighted, and like you don't understand statistics. Like,
and you don't understand what it takes the sacrifices it takes to do the job either.
Yeah, it's a bad look. Like, keep that to yourself.
Yeah.
Don't be a jerk with advice in general for a neurosurgery applicant.
Yeah.
Or like in life.
Don't say things that don't show that you don't have insight into how everything works. Yeah.
Right.
And I think this is also this is very obvious, but like it is in your best interest to avoid controversial topics. Like if you get asked about something, you have to be prepared to answer politely and hopefully in a way that will allow you to elegantly change the topic and pivot to a less controversial subject quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not a great idea to bring up religion, politics, etc. Those sorts of things. You don't know what people's values are. You don't know what people's practices are. You don't know what recent experiences they've had. And it's it's like going on a date. You don't necessarily want to ask questions that are going to put someone in the wrong kind of mood or make you have to confront a more philosophical disagreement with someone who is in the empowered position in the relationship.
Right.
Like that's likely to hurt you rather than help you. If for no other reason, you seem like you've got bad judgment.
Yeah. I think that we've dissected this out pretty well.
I want to plug Chris Graffeo's article on all this that he wrote for our neurosurgery newsletter some time ago, and we put it on neurosurgerymatch.org. If you go to Sub-Eyes, it's called Hot on the Trail. And I want to read one passage because I think it's the best thing I've ever read about this, and I'm so impressed when I saw it. So it says, at all times, be interested, helpful, respectful, professional, and present without being obstructive. Even the best students slow down resident team. Show sensitivity to this, and you will stand out by default. Be prepared, be early, know your patients, their imaging, their numbers, and their plans inside and out, and ask if there's any pre-rounding you can assist the residents with in the morning. Scrub as many cases as possible, stay late, and offer to take on low-impact scut work where appropriate. Parentheses, dressing changes, bed checks, etc. In parentheses. However, if you're told there's nothing to do or explicitly encouraged to leave the hospital, always do as instructed. Few things annoy residents more than a student who does not listen. If possible, make a point to meet and scrub frequently with the chairman, the program director, and the senior faculty while showing sensitivity to the fact that any other rotators will share the same goal, and you will need to always be collegial and considerate. There you go.
Amen.
We should have just put that in here. No, we didn't even need to have
There's
this
more of
conversation.
that. There's more of that on neurosurgerymatch.org under the Sub-Eyes.
We'll make sure that we get all these links consolidated, and so people can find all this info. That's great. Yeah, I think that's a great way to summarize everything that we talked about today. Well, our guests have been Dr. Christopher Graffeo and Dr. Joey Linzey. Thank you so much for being on tonight, and I hope you guys have a great day.
Appreciate you
Thanks
guys
so much.
All right.
Thank you so much for having us, and have fun out there, everyone. It's a great time. It's the start of something really amazing. Hope to meet you.
Thank you. Hey, if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, follow, and leave a comment in Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your audio content. Make sure to follow MSNTC and the YNC on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and check out our webpage at neurosurgerytraining.org/TNJ, where you can find other episodes and links and resources related to today's conversation. Be sure to check out the YNC's webinar series and visit their webpage on AANS.org. If you have comments or ideas for episodes, or would like to join us to talk about anything neurosurgery related, our email address is tnjpodcast@neurosurgerytraining.org. We'd love to hear from you. Finally, I'd like to thank Matt Rosenthal, one of our fantastic MSNTC volunteers, for helping with the editing and processing, and also thank all the fabulous people involved in this project. Have a great day, and we look forward to next time.
everyone, Ryan Rad here from neurosurgerytraining.org. If you like that video, subscribe and donate to keep our content available for medical students across the world.